So I'm having a conversation with my dad yesterday about the Colts, and he asked me a really, really simple question. One that if he had asked me a month ago, I would have just given him the quickest yes of my life. But when he asked it yesterday, it gave me pause. And all he did was ask me, did Anthony Richardson work with Josh Allen's mechanics coach this offseason? And what I realized in that moment was, hell, we don't really have the answer to that question, do we? And I know some of you are thinking right off the bat, of course we have the answer to that question. We were told that going into the offseason, but real quick, let me just walk you through that timeline, at least as I remember it. We get a report from Sports Illustrated. The first report we really get, the first major piece of news we get about the Indianapolis Colts going into this offseason is that Anthony Richardson is working with Chris Hess. Chris Hess, for those of you guys who have forgotten his name or just missed the story entirely, that's the guy that Josh Allen, who many people compare Anthony Richardson to in terms of his perceived strengths, his perceived weaknesses, who he could become. Josh Allen is sort of the archetype. Well, Josh Allen credits Chris Hess as the single most important person in developing his throwing mechanics that he has worked with in his entire career, okay? So we received a report that Richardson was going to be working with that guy. Now, we get a separate report. I don't know, a couple weeks later, a month later at most, whatever the timeline was. After that report, we get a separate report that Anthony Richardson is going to be working with Josh Allen himself this offseason. Now, fast forward to the first media availability we had, the first organized media availability for the Colts we had since the end of last season. We hear from Anthony Richardson for the first time in a meaningful period of time, and a reporter goes on and asks him whether or not he worked with Josh Allen this offseason. Hear what I say. He asked him whether or not he worked with Josh Allen this offseason. Anthony Richardson sort of chuckles, shrugs it off, and says, no, that was not true. And then all of a sudden, they're moving on to the next question. Well, hold on. Excuse me. Back up a second. If you're that reporter and you're asking about Josh Allen, how could you possibly, and I'm not trying to give the guy a hard time because I'm sure he's good at his job, but how could you possibly not then follow up about whether or not he worked with Chris Hess? Like, if one of those things is not true, how can we trust the other? And I listen, to some degree in the reporter's defense, in the heat of the moment, I'm sure much easier said than done in hindsight to say, man, you should have followed up with that question. Listen, if you don't ask, you don't ask. You don't exactly get a redo. So it's not to poo-poo the reporter, okay? But good grief. I mean, at the same time, what a huge miss right there by Colts Media, because now all of a sudden we're left to guess. We're left to speculate. Again, if that report about working with Josh Allen was not true, how are we sure that we can trust the one about Chris Hess himself? Now, some of you, I'm sure, may say, well, hey, if the one about Josh Allen wasn't true and you're wondering whether or not he worked with Chris Hess, the fact that the one with Josh Allen wasn't true, Justin, you already have your answer, or at least you could assume the answer. And maybe that's true, but at the same time, working with Josh Allen is not the same thing as working out with a guy that helped Josh Allen. And I suppose for me, to bring this up, my point in bringing it up is that it's just disappointing as someone who comes here to try to give you the story of the Indianapolis Colts in the best and most accurate way that I know possible. I try to do that to the best of my ability. The difference between us knowing the answer to this question, one that we accepted as truth, the difference between us knowing and not knowing is simply someone in Colts media that has the opportunity to do so, just asking whether or not he worked with Chris Hess or asking how it's been going with Chris Hess. It's not like he's not going to answer the question. What's he going to do? Say no comment? That would be even weirder than saying no. I mean, he's just going to say yes or no, or then tell you how it was working with Chris Hess. So it's not a matter of it being a question that you wouldn't get the answer to. It's just a flat out oversight by the media. And it's not even just Anthony Richardson. Nobody has been asked. Now that I'm thinking about it, not Chris Ballard, not Shane Steichen. Nobody asked about that, which was the biggest report that we got about this team. Basically the entire offseason. Of course, you have free agency and the draft, but I'm talking about things that are unrelated to acquisitions. There was no bigger piece of news than Anthony Richardson working with Chris Hess. And again, It's just a major part of our thesis for optimism about Anthony Richardson going into this year. All of a sudden, we can't entirely be sure that we can trust. Now, listen, to be fair, even if he's not working with Chris Hess, that's not the only guy that can help Anthony Richardson work on his mechanics. So it's not like if he's not working with Chris Hess, he's not working on his mechanics. Not exactly my point, but it's just so, again, a matter of it's a huge piece of information that we thought we had that at this point, I mean, unless someone asks, we'll never know if that was true. I mean, what the actual fuck, if I'm to be 100% honest with you. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Anthony Richardson and his development and really just, what we would normally talk about with Anthony Richardson. And I actually want to let you guys in at some point in this episode on a piece of insight that I have from last offseason, from training camp, that I never brought to the table. Primarily because I just didn't think much of it at the time. But as I continue to think about Anthony Richardson and what it is that we're about to see or what it is that we're about to not see, this is something that popped into my brain that it really, in hindsight, was a huge breadcrumb to what we saw going on. If only I had the foresight, I could have brought it to you then, and Coltstradamus could have struck back once more. But with that, we'll talk about Richardson. We'll talk about some questions that I've been pondering. But before we do, you know what it is. My name is Justin. This right here is the Behind the Bench Colts podcast. As always, ask everyone watching and enjoying the show, go ahead, shoot a like. It's going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. Of course, subscribe if you want to be a part of the journey. We're on our way to 4,000 subscribers over here on the YouTube channel. We want to get there by the start of next season. Audio listeners, leave a five-star review. Let the people know how much you're enjoying the show. But most importantly, if you're on YouTube and engaging in the comment section, be civil with one another. You don't know what the person on the other end of the keyboard is going through. So if you disagree, simply take it as a moment to share your side of things and try to educate them. Listen, I am a complete idiot, okay? But when it comes to the Indianapolis Colts, I have never been wrong in my entire life. I've never been wrong about this team. And if you could reference a time where I have been wrong, make no mistake, it's not that I was wrong. It was simply that you misheard me. I've never been wrong. So the reason I bring that up is because the goal over here is to further the discussion about this team, okay? So often do I see conversations about a damn football team. I mean, my goodness, I love football as much as anyone, but this is just a game. So often I see conversations about the team kind of degraded to name calling and like insults and stuff like that. No need for it. Let's raise the level of discussion we're having over here about the Indianapolis Colts. But without further ado, let's get back into the regularly scheduled program because we have quite a bit to talk about with Anthony Richardson. And as we know, the questions around Richardson's preparation started to come up really, let's just call it what it is, after he got benched. Prior to being benched, no one had any questions about Anthony Richardson's work ethic, okay? In fact, all we had heard up to this point in his career had been how hard he worked, okay? It wasn't until things started to go south that we started to get the first direct public signs of the fact that perhaps there was something awry in his preparation. And it came after a game against the Vikings, I believe, right? Where Kenny Moore and Julian Blackmon started to voice their opinion, saying things like not everyone's putting in the work. And the same things we see in practice, what we're seeing in the game. And by the way, just as a side note, I absolutely hate players doing that type of thing during the season. If you have a fucking problem with the way things are going in the organization, handle it at the end of the season, okay? They're paying you plenty of money right now to just go out there and fucking play. I mean, like a fucking hole in the head with the way things were going with the Indianapolis Colts. Did they need players coming out and speaking to the media? And it's not the first time we had gotten some internal leaks from anonymous players or just flat out, at least you put your name on it, right? Okay, so Kenny Moore and Julian Blackmon, fine. But there was anonymous reports. This stuff is nonsense. But that's neither here nor there. It's really not my point, right? We had those guys talking just a complete sideshow from me right there. But we had Kenny Moore and Julian Blackmon come out after that Vikings game. I think even DeForest Buckner felt the need to say something. And then you had guys like Pat McAfee, who certainly have not been shy about what they've heard or what they think they've heard or what they think they know about Anthony Richardson. Okay, so all of those things were public signs of what was something that was seemingly an issue that was bubbling in the background behind the scenes for the Indianapolis Colts. But the reality is that there were signs of that much sooner if we had simply had the foresight. But again, hindsight 2020, but let's talk in 2020 right now. One of those signs, and this is not the insight that I promised you just yet, the Bengals defenders. Do you remember this? The Colts had a joint practice with the Bengals in the preseason, or really, I guess, whenever it was. I forget how the timing worked out. Before the season started, for sure, they had a joint practice with the Cincinnati Bengals. And there were all these reports coming out of this practice that the Bengals defense was chirping Richardson all damn day, basically saying this dude can't hit the broadside of a barn. I mean, they're like, does he only run? Can he throw? I mean, it was not good stuff we heard out of that Bengals practice. Now, I wasn't there. I don't know. But at the same time, with what we saw, I certainly believe that it's exactly what we heard it was, okay? But I can also give you something even before that Bengals practice that I witnessed with my own eyes in training camp, not only really last year, but in his rookie year as well. But I felt really more so last year. And perhaps that's me taking part in some sort of revisionist history. But nonetheless, the way Anthony Richardson approached practice in training camp last year, and even pregame, I'd gone to see him versus the Jets. This was a very similar thing. Not quite the same, not quite as intense. But in training camp, I mean, this dude was dancing, laughing, lackadaisical throws, particularly in like the warm-ups before the practice. I mean, he's throwing shit off his back foot. Like there wasn't a serious rep that he had outside of like the team drills. Like when you're talking about the warm-ups beforehand, I mean, he was kind of just out there doing whatever the hell he wanted. So I guess my first question is, if you were at a game last year before he was benched or at training camp, did you notice any of what it is? Like, I'm not revising history here. There was absolutely something there. And again, at the same time, as I've said a number of times this episode, hindsight is 2020. When you're there in the moment, I mean, you're just basically enamored with the fact that you're watching Anthony Richardson play. Like, this is your franchise quarterback. You certainly don't want to tear him down. I'm rooting for Anthony Richardson more than anyone. I mean, you like the personality. You like the fact that he's bringing a little bit of energy to the field. All that stuff is good and well. But I do feel now that as I look back at what I witnessed in that training camp, I was watching a microcosm of what ultimately played out for the rest of the season for Anthony Richardson and for the Colts. And I bring that up simply as a little nugget for you. If you go to training camp this year, take a look at how Anthony Richardson is before practice starts, when everyone's just warming up. Is he taking a little bit more seriously? Does he look a little more locked in? Or does he look like, hell, let's just have some fun, man. Like, let's just be here, okay? Because it's going to be something that I'm curious to hear about as we go into training camp this year. It would be something that, and spoiler alert, I won't be at training camp this year. I promise you one day, and I've been 2 straight years. You guys have really enjoyed that coverage. I promise one day, hear me now. And this is the first time I'm saying this. One day, the reason I did not go to training camp this offseason will be revealed, and it will all be worth it in the end. But neither here nor there, okay? All of this stuff about Anthony Richardson, the lack of preparation, the lackadaisical approach, all this stuff poses really a few questions about him, about the Colts, about football, all of it, okay? Really one that we have as fans that we've discussed a ton. One that is, I guess, more of a question about coaching, and one that is from a skill set and development standpoint, and we'll bring them up in that order. So number one, does Anthony Richardson, or does it really a poor preparation or a lack of urgency in preparation, does that inherently make him lazy because that happened? Like, because things happened the way they happened last year, are we armed with the information that Anthony Richardson is a lazy guy? Now, I personally am inclined to say no to that, okay? Because I think you could have great character, great work ethic, but you can also just be naive. Like, you don't know what you don't know. For example, if somebody has wronged you, listen, at the end of the day, the result is all the same. And this is a results-driven league. I understand that much. But for the sake of the analogy, if someone has wronged you, listen, you can still be upset that they did it. But when it comes to actually condemning that person for what they did to you, their intent is very much a big deal. Like, if they meant to wrong you, then that's a real problem. But if they maybe overlooked the fact that it could have wronged you, well, all right, if you care about this person, you do give them the benefit of the doubt. That being said, they have to prove you wrong on the back end. Now that you've brought it to their attention, they're no longer naive, right? But my point is that, hey, perhaps Richardson was just a little naive. And I've brought this up before, so I promise, if you've heard this spiel from me a number of times, everything's timestamped, okay? So you could skip past it. I'll bring you some stuff you haven't heard before, okay? But some people do say that has to do with a Shane Steichen, okay? So people are looking and saying, if he's not working hard, why aren't you teaching him to work hard? And to that I say, if you're Shane Steichen, what the hell are you supposed to do? Wrap a fucking ankle monitor around him when he goes home? I mean, at some point, you have to let an adult be an adult, okay? And if Richardson, if the expectation is that he brings the job home with him and he's doing stuff on his own time, you kind of have to trust that he's going to go out and do that type of thing, which does bring me to question number two, which I think is, I don't know. I'm just curious if you thought about it this way. What is the line when you have a player between checking him for his actions and what you're seeing out of him on the practice field and letting him be who he is? For example, I'll bring it to UFC real quick. Promises will come back around to the Colts. John Jones. Many people would say John Jones is the greatest fighter to ever live. But if you're to point to someone who prepared the right way, John Jones is not the guy that you look at, okay? Because this was a dude that's doing drugs, drinking, partying, all this stuff before fights, undefeated fighter. He never lost. But he wasn't preparing. This is not the way you would tell someone to prepare. Dennis Rodman, a guy in the NBA, was absolutely out of his fucking mind off the court, right? Doing all the Carmen Electra, the whole. Go ahead and look at the lore of Dennis Rodman. I mean, this was a guy who was very undisciplined off the court, but when he came out, he was ready to play. And people would argue for guys like John Jones and guys like Dennis Rodman that even if what they did off the field didn't exactly fall into the mold of what you would want someone to do off the field, part of what made them who they were on the field, in the octagon, on the court, was that level of being unhinged, was the things that you looked at and judged them for, even if they weren't the mold, were part of what made them who they were and part of what made them great. And I bring that up because if you're a coach, you don't exactly want to take the fun away from someone. So if Anthony Richardson is dancing on the field and he's having fun, right? And this guy is having a good time in what is seemingly a serious situation as you prepare for the season, there's a fine line, right? Because you don't want to take away who a guy is. Like, you want to let them be who they are. Like, sure, in sport, preparation is king, ultimately, unless you're John Jones or Dennis Rodman. Like, generally speaking, if you prepare seriously or the need to prepare seriously is a non-negotiable, okay? But in Richardson's case, because I'm talking about seeing him in practice, the way he's approaching practice, okay? Not the game, practice. When it comes to executing in those situations in real time, this is something maybe a lot of people don't know. How serious you are in the moment, how seriously you're taking that moment, has nothing to do with how well you execute in that moment. The best players, write this down. This is notes for you, okay? This is something that perhaps this is why you're here and not somewhere else. The best players in any sport, it's not so much that they're so much better than the guy across from them. It's that they can remain calm and comfortable in situations where most others are tense and uncomfortable. The best players in sports can slow it down in a way that other guys cannot. And I'm not saying that now, as we look back, we have the evidence this was the case with Richardson, but I'm speaking from a coaching perspective. The balance between watching a guy dick off a bit, between watching a guy being a little lackadaisical and simply just being comfortable in the moment, I mean, that's a very delicate balance. And that's not exactly an easy thing to identify. And you don't want to exactly be presumptuous either. I'd imagine there's no perfect science either way. And I think the Colts, and Shane Steichen particularly, in the moment, perhaps thought they were watching a guy in Anthony Richardson who had a calm, comfortable presence or even a composure, right? They maybe thought they were watching a guy being himself in practice and letting him be himself, giving him room to be himself. And so he could be comfortable within the flow of the game and in the flow of practice. And I think what they realized as the season went on is that's not what they were looking at. They were looking at a guy who did not realize how serious the situation was. And we'll see how that plays up. And it actually brings us to really the third question and the most daunting question, quite frankly. Even if Anthony Richardson has learned his lesson, even if Anthony Richardson is taking everything seriously and doing everything the way he's supposed to be doing, preparing like fucking Tom Brady out there, even if he's addressed every single issue, is it going to be enough? Or in other words, in the NFL, where you have the elite of the elite out there, all of which are continuing to meticulously learn and hone their craft to the point of nearly being a psychopath, particularly at the quarterback position. Does a year or two of subpar preparation, or for all we know, even further, because the odds are that if he got to the NFL and wasn't doing what it took, his work habits in college probably weren't exactly, he probably lacked a real mentor at the, from the start. This is my guess, this is speculation, probably lacked a mentor in terms of this is how you're supposed to work at the quarterback. I don't know. Like, there was really no one better than him at Florida either. Neither here nor there. Let me stay focused. If he up to this point has not been preparing from the mental aspect the way he's supposed to, has it put him behind the 8 ball in a way that he can't overcome? Like, can you really go from a guy that's completing less than 50% of your passes in this league to someone who could consistently move an offense and complete 60+% of your passes, which really is kind of the benchmark in this league as to whether or not even Daniel Jones completed 62% of his passes with the Giants? We all have an opinion. Like the question I just asked, you have your knee-jerk reaction to that. I have my knee-jerk reaction to that. And it's a question that you could probably give a good answer and say, no, he can't overcome that, okay? And I think history would probably be on your side. But we don't know for sure. The only thing we do know for sure is that we are about to find out. Anthony Richardson, in my opinion, is about to be one of the most interesting use cases of a quarterback that this league has ever seen. I think if Anthony Richardson doesn't work out, hypothetically, hell, even if he does, I think he's going to be a guy that people look back on. I just think there's always going to be a topic. I think he's going to be a reference point in history for the league. And I don't just say that as a Colts fan, because you're talking about a guy who's very unique. It's almost like Tim Tebow, but if he had all the talent, right? Like Tim Tebow, at the end of the day, just wasn't a good enough thrower of the football. Anthony Richardson, on the other hand, he can. Like, when Anthony Richardson can throw, he can fucking throw. It's just the consistency or the lack thereof. So he is going to be a guy that I think people look back on, and we're watching history play out before our very eyes, particularly for the Indianapolis Colts, if nothing else. So I'm curious kind of what you think about anything I just said. Did anything stick out? I don't know. Then talk in the comments section. You know what it is. I'm always looking in there. But that was an episode. Until next time, my name is Justin. This right here was the Ryan the Bench Colts podcast. Like, subscribe if you have not yet. And as always, go Colts.